for joining this very important event for us as Socialists and Democrats in the European Parliament. For us, this is not just a conference that we're organizing here today, but it is the very heart and soul of what we fight every day in the European Parliament, but also outside of our institution, because what is happening right now also with regards to the directive that everyone is discussing is important to us, also what is happening in Council, and obviously we will keep to push in order for the Council to come also on board with the position of the Commission and the majority that we have here in the European Parliament for the inclusion of rape and consent in this directive. I come from a country, unfortunately, where so far we're still opposing this in Council, but we'll keep on fighting to see that this also finds the support of the majority of member states in the Council. But without further ado, I'll just leave the floor to the president of our Socialist and Democrat group here in the European Parliament, Irache Garcia Perez, for her comments. Thank you. Thank you, Irache. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your leadership on women's rights and the rights of all minorities and those who are vulnerable in our society. I remember the first time that I saw you was during the Maltese presidency of the Council when you stood up in Parliament to stand up for women's rights when they were being attacked by fascist thoughts in Parliament. And I think you were inspiring for us that day, but you're still inspiring to us all throughout our work here in the European Parliament. And I cannot stress enough how much important it is for us to see that the Council as well as an institution is in favor of including rape and consent in this directive, because not doing so, I look at this as literally throwing women under the bus, literally forgetting about what is so much important for women today and in their everyday lives. We have met as an office people today who have gone through rape. We have been discussing this across our member state as well. And how can one remain silent when you hear these stories? We must break the silence, and we must also break the silence in Council. And we will keep on working to push for the Council to join us and the Commission in this venture to see that rape and consent are also included in this important directive that we finally have. Now we will move towards a recorded performance of a song called We Are Listening by Ezra.
There's no way to make this wrong right.
think one of the words, obviously, of this song resonate so much with the cause that we are talking about today. But I think the fact that everyone was mentioned shows that this is the fight of every one of us. It shouldn't be just the fight of one section of our community. It's not just the fight of women. It is the fight of all of us that need to speak out on this very important topic. This is something that we have worked on a lot as a group of socialists and democrats in the European Parliament, but not only. And now we will move on to one of our commissioners, Commissioner Helena Dalli, coming from my own country, who has worked a lot for this to be actually included back home in my country of Malta. And I'm very happy to have her obviously propose this directive, but also to have her with us here today in a video message that she wanted to send us. She couldn't be here with us today, unfortunately, but we will hear her words anyhow.
The last thing that a victim should do is explain what they were wearing, how much they drank that night, or why they didn't refrain from social media. We must stop this victim blaming dynamic. The EU gender equality strategy recognizes the urgency of ending gender based violence. It outlines a strategy for ensuring that everyone is safe in their homes, their close relationships, their workplaces, in public spaces, and online. Combating all forms of violence against women and domestic violence is a key priority for this Commission. Therefore, we pushed for the European Union's accession to the Council of Europe Istanbul Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence in June, and the EU finally became party to the convention last October. The proposal for a directive on combating violence against women is currently in trialogues between Council and Parliament. The co-legislators are working hard with our support. Regrettably, I have not seen tangible progress so far. I hope we will see a breakthrough at the next trialogue. One key sticking point is the negotiations is the criminalization of rape based on a lack of consent. A majority of member states still require the use of force or threats for an act to be qualified as rape. Such outdated definitions can no longer remain acceptable in the European Union. I am urging member states to show more flexibility on this point and to make use of the existing legal basis that has already been used to criminalize sexual abuse of children. I thank you for your support on this and other key elements of the directive. I hope that we will be able is also working on a recommendation on preventing and combating harmful practices against women and girls. The recommendation will take an intersectional approach, presenting concrete actions for the prevention, protection, and support of women and girls from the most vulnerable groups, such as women and girls with disabilities, Roma women, as well as LGBTIQ women. It will complement the directive and help to effectively prevent and combat gender-based violence. We are expecting it to be adopted in the first half of 2024. Looking ahead at the European Parliament elections, it is vital to ensure that parties put forward a gender-balanced list. This is especially true for the PES. I want to see women equally represented in our Parliament. Only through adequate representation can we guarantee that the next legislature will embrace our gender equality agenda. I thank you.
We thank Commissioner Helena Dalli for her message and for her push towards equality all throughout her mandate, even before her mandate in her previous roles in my own member state, but then as European Commissioner for Equality. And I now, with pleasure, move towards our co-rapporteur, our S&D rapporteur, our colleague Evan Incher, who is currently leading the European Parliament negotiations with the Council on this directive, together with our EPP colleague and co-rapporteur. Evan, the floor is all yours, and thank you for your work.
Thank you very much, Cyrus. And thank you, Rachi, also for being with us and holding a so strong speech. I want to emphasize something that I think maybe doesn't need to be said here, but I will still say it. And that is, in the end, what we are fighting for is human rights, because women's rights are human rights. We need to end discrimination. We need to end all kind of violence that women and girls all across our 27 member states is every day in different ways being hit by. Because it really affects at least the half of the population. Women and girls all across our 27 member states. Globally, approximately 81,100 women are killed, half of them as a consequence of domestic violence. 60% of women and girls have been victims of violence either on their phones, and everyone nowadays more or less have phones, or online. 60%. And every third woman in the European Union, as already been mentioned, are survivors of either sexual or physical violence. Violence is nothing else than depriving someone their human rights. If men and boys would have disproportionately, and because of their gender, being victims of violence, the whole society, I'm very sure of, would have reacted. But still, 2023, women and girls are second-class citizens in our own societies. So we really need to consign this discrimination and this violence to the dustbin of history. So therefore, this directive that was presented the 8th of March 2022 that Irache mentioned and also Commissioner Dalli mentioned on combating violence and domestic violence is so important, an important step, because it's only one of the first steps before we reach union free from violence, a feminist union, because we have so much more to do. I am glad, of course, as many others, that the directive was presented last year, 8th of March. However, at the same time, it's been a battle that the S&D Group led, and in the beginning of the mandate, we demanded, actually, if we're going to vote for an EPP president, then she also needs to promise to put gender equality on the top on the agenda. And we did manage to also ensure that the President of the Commission delivers on our priority areas, not at least gender equality. And we have been already had 3, I should say, trialogues with the Council, and with the Council through, of course, the Spanish presidency. The Spanish presidency, I really need to applaud them, have big ambitions, but unfortunately, these ambitions are not accommodated by all other governments. So we really need to ensure to put pressure on the other governments also to take their share of responsibility. We managed in Sweden, for example, to mobilize in favor of the consent-based rape legislation, to include it in the directive, because either the Swedish presidency during the half of the first year, who led the work and under whom also the position of the council was decided on, didn't manage to include the consent-based rape legislation, and they didn't work hard. But we managed, through the mobilization of the women's organizations in Sweden, to make them change from a no to a yes just a couple of weeks ago. This shows that we have a lot of mobilization to do in the other member states also, and that nothing is impossible. I must say that in some countries, I expected that they will not be in favor of including a consent-based rape legislation or wanting to water down the directive, but in some other countries or by some other governments, I didn't expect it. I didn't expect it by the German government, and I didn't expect it by the French government. But unfortunately, right now, one of the final decisions is to be taken by France and Germany as two of the biggest countries within the European Union. On one hand, it is on the table of President Macron himself in France, and in Germany it is on the table of Minister of Justice, Marco Buschmann. It's two men who is sitting on an important decision for women and girls all across our union. So I would encourage all of us in here to contact whomever we can contact in order to make these two men understand that this directive, a directive which aim is to prevent and combat sexual violence, cannot not include a consent-based rape legislation. The inclusion of a consent-based rape legislation should be the bare minimum. And then we should add even more progressive and important things within it that ensures that we go from words to actions when it comes to saving women and girls' lives, because in the end it is all about saving life, all about ensuring that all of us, not only half of the population but the whole population, have access to their fundamental rights. And I believe that we are the group that actually can ensure that we go from words to action. And these last days of activities and events are very much important to highlight the importance of this directive and the inclusion of a consent-based rape legislation. I will take an example. In Sweden, for example, 5 years ago, 2018, we introduced the Swedish consent-based rape legislation. Since then, the sentences have increased with 75%. This shows that the consent-based rape legislation actually matters, both ensuring that the perpetrators knows that there will not be impunity. Impunity should not exist in any part of the European Union, but also laws are norm settings, which means that it will send a clear signal to everybody that consent, as said in the song, that consent is key. And discussion on consent needs to start on an early age, because we know that men's violence against women starts with boys' violence against girls. And in the end, it starts with what we teach our children. So with this said, once again, thank you very much for this very important event. I really encourage us, all of us, to do what we can because we can only do this together, as Irache said in the beginning, to put pressure on the governments across the 27 member states that we don't accept a directive without a consent-based rape legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. As you said, it was not expected by certain member states, and I must reiterate once again, I did not expect it from my member state to be against this inclusion in the directive as well, and I keep on urging the government to also change its position in this regard. But now, with us today, I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker, Kirstine Holst. Kirstine is a Danish journalist. She's a consent activist and a rape survivor herself. We are very happy to have you here, Kirstine, with us in the European Parliament. We are grateful for all your work and for your advocacy and consent laws in Denmark, but all across Europe as well. And thank you for showing the courage to speak out when I know it's very difficult for so many people who have gone through, what you have been through, to actually go public. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak here today on the important topic of rape and consent. It is a topic that I have worked on previously in many different capacities and in several European countries, because I know from my own experience that consent-based rape laws changes not only legislation but also cultures, because legislation carries cultures. I became a part of Amnesty International's Let's Talk About Yes campaign to advocate for consent-based rape laws all over Europe. I did it when my own human rights were violated, and I founded afterward, together with other rape survivors, the first organization in Denmark with the sole purpose to improve the conditions for rape survivors. I understand that currently a directive on gender-based violence is being negotiated and that many EU countries is blocking for the inclusion of consent-based rape legislation. It is most important that we change these outdated attitudes to women and violence, that refusing to criminalize rape across the EU is an expression of. Consent-based rape legislation is by now an internationally acknowledged human rights standard, for example, as defined in the Istanbul Convention. I was happy to see that EU finally ratified the Istanbul Convention, because at a time where there is a backlash for women's rights in Europe, it is very important that we never go below the standard of the Istanbul Convention when addressing gender-based violence. The right to make decisions about your own body, the right to bodily and sexual autonomy and integrity are fundamental human rights that should belong to all citizens in Europe. Previously in Denmark, we had a legal definition of rape based on violence, force, threats, and being able to prove physical resistance. In many other EU countries, it is still like this, such as, for example, in France. Even in cases where the victim resisted by words, it was not legally accepted as rape unless the resistance was so visible that she, for example, have engaged in a physical fight with her rapist, or in cases where she had suffered so much violence that resistance was impossible, or it could be proved that she had been in a condition where she could not resist. With laws like this, with demand for resistance, a woman's body is, at a starting point, available for sex with anyone at any time until she had resisted enough. Very few victims will resist because they are in a state of trauma, or sometimes with the aim of saving their own life by not resisting physically. Often their brains have learned earlier in life that resistance can be dangerous and escalate the violence. These are natural reactions to violence for a human being. It is science. Having laws that require a victim of violence to actively resist their perpetrator is culture. Culture based on old and ancient dogmas and social rules, which were about the honor of the family and another man. From long time ago, when a woman was someone's property and her value was measured by her innocence and purity and her ability to defend the same. Rape was not a crime against a woman, it was a crime against another man. It is absurd that we have laws that pay more attention to old dogmas than to the individual's right to one's own body. It is absurd that on that basis we demand that rape victims must fight their perpetrators and run a tremendous risk. Because while the lack of resistance can downscale the level of violence, at the same time resistance can cost you your life. Your attempt to save your own life can lead to the perpetrator not being convicted if the legal definition is not based on the lack of consent. With a consent-based rape law, your body is at a starting point, of course, yours and only yours, and at no time available to anyone unless given your consent freely by expressing a yes. With a consent-based rape law, no person is forced to fight with their rapist in order to win the case in court or to win their right to their own body during the rape, in the court, or in society. Your body is your own, you decide, just like you decide over your house, your car, and your personal data. It should be simple, but it's not, because rape myths like misogynist culture and attitudes has for centuries blocked for progress for not only access to justice, but also for equality. Because rape primarily hits women, and rape has huge consequences for women's possibility to live and develop their lives, and like such become one of the biggest barriers for equality. In my country, in Europe, and in the whole world. Consent-based rape laws changes cultures and attitudes and counters harmful gender stereotypes and rape myths. We see this in Denmark, where the work is still going on 2 years after the adoption of the consent-based rape law. It takes time, but it's happening, and we are on our way to a better place. Consent-based rape law changes the way we speak about sex. It changes the way we understand sexual violence, and it changes the way we see and interact with each other. I very much hope that a consent-based rape legislation will be included in the EU directive, because like this, we can be a part of a future that is more gender equal and be a part of creating a Europe that is more safe and just for both men and women, and no longer with a law that belongs to a long time ago. We want a law that points to the future. So I'm calling the EU to set a standard and be a role model for the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Our next speaker is from Grevio, which is the Council of Europe monitoring mechanism that monitors the implementation of the Istanbul Convention. Thank you for being with us online, and we look forward to hear your expert input on rape and consent laws in Europe. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak and exchange on today's very important topic. As has been said already now, rape is not only a pervasive crime and a form of violence against women, but also one of the most underreported crimes and the least likely to end in conviction. Let me first begin my intervention by giving you just a very rapid overview of the Istanbul Convention and its role. The Convention is known to be the most far-reaching and ambitious international human rights treaty targeting the elimination of violence against women. And it aims to eradicate this form of violence by tackling it from all fronts, that is, prevention, protection of victims, prosecution of perpetrators, and by also requiring the enactment of integrated and coordinated policies. Through the provisions of the Convention, it really provides a roadmap to all countries on what is needed to achieve the goal of zero violence. Next slide, please. Now, the Convention sets up a monitoring mechanism which assists countries in preventing and combating violence against women more effectively. And it is composed on one side by Grevio, which is the group of experts on action against violence against women, which is formed of 15 independent experts. And on the other side, the Committee of the Parties, which is made up of representatives of governments. And these are two distinct bodies, but they interact with one another. In particular, Grevio, after a thorough evaluation of the country on the basis of the state report, NGO reports, but also an on-site visit in the country, it draws up a report containing in-depth analysis of how the country is implementing the provisions of the convention. And in particular, it formulates tailor-made recommendations on how to improve the country's response to violence against women. And for these reasons, and many more, the convention has received 2 prestigious international prizes and is frequently referred to as the gold standard, including by the UN. Next slide, please. As regards in particular rape and sexual violence, the convention provides really a comprehensive framework to, on the one side, prevent, criminalize, and prosecute these offenses, and it requires the setting up also of specialist support services for victims. Today, I will focus on the criminalization of sexual violence and rape under Article 36 of the Convention, and also on the extent to which states which have ratified the Convention have implemented this provision and also the approaches that they have taken. But I will also touch upon the importance of preventive actions such as education, awareness raising, and training, because these measures are absolutely essential to change the paradigm and ensure that mentalities are not shaped by stereotypes, but forged instead on the principle of gender equality and the right to personal integrity. Next slide, please. As you will see here, there's the definition of rape under Article 36 of the Convention. I will not read it out, but of course, the central legal element of the definition of sexual violence and rape is the lack of consent given voluntarily as the result of the first person's free will. Next slide. And this position is in line, of course, with the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights, in particular the case MC against Bulgaria, in which the court found that while in practice it may sometimes be difficult to prove lack of consent in the absence of direct proof of rape, such as traces of violence or direct witnesses, the authorities must nevertheless explore all the facts and decide on the basis of an assessment of all the surrounding circumstances. And the investigation and its conclusions must be centered on the issue of non-consent. It also clarified that any rigid approach to the prosecution of sexual offenses, such as requiring proof of physical resistance in all circumstances, risks leaving certain types of rape unpunished and jeopardizing the effective protection of the individual's sexual autonomy. Next slide, please. Also, the explanatory report of the Istanbul Convention clarifies that the prosecution of this offense requires a context-sensitive assessment of the evidence in order to establish on a case-by-case basis whether the victim has freely consented to the sexual act performed, and also that this assessment should not be based on assumptions of typical behavior in such situations, and must recognize the wide range of behavioral responses to sexual violence and rape which victims exhibit, and which the speaker before me mentioned, of course. And these responses can be fighting, of course, but also flight, freezing, flopping, or befriending. Next slide, please. Now, from a review of Grevio's monitoring activity to date, state parties to the Istanbul Convention have taken 4 different approaches in the criminalization of sexual violence, including rape. There are those that use an approach based on force or coercion, which were mentioned before, and in its reports, Grevio has highlighted that one of the consequences of a model based on force is a shift of attention to the behavior of the victim rather than the actions of the accused, and of course that certain cases of rape go unpunished. Now, several countries unfortunately continue to apply this approach, including amongst the European EU countries. We have France, Italy, Poland, and the Netherlands, to name a few. Having said this, these legal systems also recognize situations that invalidate consent. For instance, in the case of incapacity of a victim, or where the victim is in a state of unconsciousness. And in these cases, it is attenuated the need to demonstrate the victim's resistance to violence. Then we have a so-called two-tiered approach. So countries that have adopted this model have one provision based on force, but in parallel they have another one based on the absence of consent. But the first type of provision often has a stronger sanction than the second. Now, in these cases, Grevio has clarified that it is the fact that the act is carried out without the consent of the victim that should determine the punishment, whether this is committed by someone who uses violence or abuses his position or power. Where, of course, the circumstances of the act are particularly violent, then aggravating should, of course, be applied to ensure a sanction that is proportionate with the gravity of the act. And then finally, we have the no means no approach, which is based on the premise that sexual intercourse is considered consensual as long as neither party says no. The prosecutor here is required to prove that the act occurred against the victim's will because she informed or made it known to the perpetrator that she did not wish to engage in sexual acts. So this approach requires that the victim has resisted either verbally or through unequivocal gestures like moving away, crying, or attempting to move away. And of course, you will see that here too, the risk is that where this approach is adopted, the onus falls again on the victim to verbally or non-verbally refuse sexual acts or to prevent sexual violence, rather than on the offender to ascertain the victim's consent. And we have, and of course, proceedings will focus on the actions of the victim rather than the perpetrator, and creating room for gender stereotypes and rape myths to resurface. And then finally, we have the only yes means yes approach, which we've spoken about, which criminalizes all sexual acts to which the victim has not given her active consent. And in this case, passivity cannot be considered as expression of consent. Next slide, please. Now, very positively, we are seeing a move towards consent-based definition in Europe, also as a result of the Istanbul Convention. Now, Grevio has said in its reports that conceptualizing sexual offenses as sexual acts committed against the victim's will, so the no means no approach, which I mentioned before, does not fully meet the requirement under Article 36 because it fails to ensure that all non-consensual sexual acts are criminalized. And so from this it can be deduced, of course, that the affirmative consent, or the yes means yes approach, is more aligned with the spirit of the Convention and with the overall objective to improve prevention, protection, and prosecution. Next slide, please. Now, does it make a difference in practice whether a country opts for no means no or yes means yes, which are both in principle consent-based? In the practical application of both concepts, difficulties of course remain. For the no means no approach, the prosecutor has to prove that there has been no consent expressed, and for the yes means yes, the prosecutor has to prove that the accused has not sought active consent. But the problem in many rape trials is, of course, the word against word, because rarely there are any witnesses or other evidence. However, there are very positive consequences, of course, of the affirmative model approach. And that is, the police questioning will shift from determining if the suspect used violence to whether the victim has consented to the act. Also, the investigations will no longer need to be dropped if no evidence of use of violence is found, and therefore more cases will go to trial. And it allows also to capture and criminalize new phenomenon of non-consensual acts, like non-consensual removal of condoms during sexual intercourse called stealthing, and drug-facilitated sexual violence, for example. And of course, most importantly, it allows a change of paradigm. That means that there will be greater awareness in society of the importance of consent in sexual relationships. Next slide, please. In terms of the case of Sweden, that was also mentioned earlier, there is a study on the consequences of the reform that was implemented in Sweden towards the yes means yes model. It shows that, yes, there has been an increase in complaints, prosecutions, and convictions for these types of crimes. And even conviction rate has increased by 75%, as has been mentioned. Also, new types of cases reach the courts, like surprise rape or situations where the victim has remained passive. Also, there's a dramatic increase of the types of evidence that are used in proceedings that end in conviction, in addition to the statement of the victim, the recording of the event, for example, but also calls to emergency services. And also there's an increase in convictions in which the only evidence used was the testimony of a person in whom the injured person had confided in. Finally, there's greater awareness in society in Sweden of the importance of consent in sexual relationships, and this concept and the importance has been introduced in school curricula, which is extremely important. Next slide, please. Now, while it is essential that the substantive law is amended in order to criminalize and punish all forms of non-consensual sexual acts, it is insufficient. We see many countries in Europe are seeing the worrying trend of gang rapes, including those broadcast through digital means, where victims and perpetrators are increasingly younger in age. And this really points to a dire need to change social and behavioral patterns through education. And of course, the Istanbul Convention provides an answer to that. It provides under Article 14 that states have to include teaching material in the curricula at all levels of education on equality between women and men, non-stereotyped gender roles, nonviolent conflict resolution, interpersonal relationship, on gender-based violence, and also on the right to personal integrity. But in its monitoring, Grevio has found a significant number of countries have insufficient teaching material on these issues, and also the teachers that do teach some of these topics are not really trained on these issues. Next slide, please. Also, of course, sexuality education is extremely important. Education on sexuality can provide a means to address some of the topics under Article 14 of the Convention, and in particular the right to personal integrity and the notion that sexual violence is based on the absence of freely given consent. Of course, it is essential also to guarantee women's sexual and reproductive rights, and it is a full component of the right to education and health. And it is essential preventive action that is crucial to raise children's awareness on rape and to protect them from harm. To give you an example, in a recent report that was just published in November now on Ireland, Grevio observed that in this country, in Ireland, the sexuality education can be opted out by parents if it is contrary to their conscience. In this respect, Grevio clarified that the respect of the right to freedom of religion or belief should be balanced with the need to protect children from sexual violence, and that sexual education is in fact a preventive action that is crucial to raise children's awareness on rape and to protect them from harm. Next slide, please. Equally important are awareness-raising campaigns aimed at sensitizing both victims as well as the general population what is rape and sexual violence. In its report on Germany that was published last year, Grevio noted with satisfaction that the reform process on rape legislation was accompanied by significant awareness-raising campaigns, which led to broad public debate. And as a result of the debate, there was an increase in reports to the police for these types of offenses. Next slide, please. Finally, it is essential that in parallel to aligning criminal legislation with the Convention, criminal justice actors are trained on a gendered understanding of violence against women, including rape, through mandatory initial and in-service training. In its reports, Grevio has consistently found lack or insufficient specialized training for law enforcement, prosecutors, or judges. And this results in poor gendered understanding of this type of violence. It results in stereotypes, in attitudes that minimize the violence, that blame the victims, or assume that victims make false allegations about violence. It also has found, Grevio, often lack of specialized protocols for the investigations of rape and sexual violence, which lead to poor case building and over-reliance on victim testimony as the primary evidence. And this contributes to low reporting and high attrition rates. In such training, it is particularly important that criminal justice actors are trained on the impact of trauma on a rape victim and how it affects the recollection of the event, the consistency of the statements made, and other aspects. In fact, often law enforcement agencies presume the untruthfulness of a statement that if it is not detailed, if there are gaps or inconsistencies, and in these cases, the investigation is often abandoned. In reality, some responses to trauma can change what people pay attention to and therefore the type of memories that a victim has. And memory can be not linear, and the victim's memories can focus on sensory perceptions. So training on these aspects are absolutely essential. My presentation comes to an end. I'd like to just draw your attention to the fact that on all these topics that I just mentioned and on Grevio's findings, you can find more information on Grevio's fourth general report, activity report, which has a specific focus section on rape and sexual violence and the approaches taken by the different states that have ratified the convention. But also another report that is very useful is the midterm horizontal review of Grevio baseline evaluation reports. It's a long title, but essentially it provides a snapshot of where countries are at in implementing the convention in Europe. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesca, for connecting with us today and for accepting our invitation to this event today. Our next speaker, before we open the floor to any of those who would like to share with us your comments, is from Amnesty International. Amnesty has been a strong advocate for consent-based rape laws and the standards of the Istanbul Convention and has carried out international research on access to justice for rape survivors. So a very warm welcome to Berber Biala Hettinga, who is the program manager on violence against in the Violence Against Women division on the Secretariat of the Istanbul Convention monitoring mechanism of the Council of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I do not deserve that title. Actually, I am an advocate for Amnesty International here in Brussels on human rights inside the EU, and indeed, the current negotiations on the directive on violence against women are part of my responsibilities. So, really, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation to join this important discussion today. In this outstanding panel, really. It's a great honor to be here with you, and I have to say it really is a great pleasure to be here with Christine, whom I've heard so much about already in the many years before, because her power and perseverance have really made a difference in the lives of so many people in Denmark and beyond. It's great to hear about the results that she accomplished in Denmark together with other survivors and also supported by Amnesty International and other organizations. Thank you for your testimony. We're discussing gender-based violence, in particular the heinous crime of rape, at a time that is crucial for the EU. And I will come back to the EU later, but I'd first like to highlight really just the overarching human rights obligations of states in this regard. This is not a legal seminar, and also many of us are probably all too aware of the different obligations, so I won't go into detail on the different articles and definitions, but it is crucial to remember that international and regional human rights law sets out a range of obligations in the field of combating gender-based violence in general and also on rape in particular. Globally, we have, of course, the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, and also specifically the General Recommendation number 35 that really speaks of this issue. And of course, as said before, and many thanks to the intervention from Grevio on this, is the Istanbul Convention, which indeed is the most far-reaching international treaty specifically designed to tackle violence against women and domestic violence. And it clearly sets out that parties shall take the necessary legislative and other measures to exercise due diligence to prevent, investigate, punish, and provide reparation for acts of violence covered by the scope of that convention that are perpetrated by non-state actors. In November 2018, Amnesty International published Right to be Free from Rape, a report that looked into rape legislation, the prevalence of rape, and access to justice for rape in 31 countries in Europe. It looked at all EU member states, which at the time included the UK, Iceland, Norway, and Switzerland. And at the time, we found that despite these clear obligations of states under international and regional human rights law, with regards to sexual violence, the predominant trend in Europe had been an increase in the number of reported rapes, alongside static or falling prosecution and conviction rates. Offences often do not come to the attention of the criminal justice system at all, as women and girls do not report them. When they do, they only have a small chance of having their case tried by a court of law, as cases are often dropped at various stages of the legal process, with alleged perpetrators never being prosecuted or convicted and never held to account for their crimes. In this regard, states are failing the due diligence obligations that they have under human rights law, both in protecting women and girls from sexual violence and providing access to justice and full reparation. A consent-based definition of rape is crucial for victims or survivors to access justice. Definitions of rape that are based on force or the threat of force, as opposed to lack of consent, fail to meet international human rights standards. And they ignore the realities that many women and girls and other survivors face in the context of rape. They overlook the fact that a person can rape without the use of physical force or violence, and they enable significant impunity for perpetrators. So while it is paramount that legislation meets international human rights standards, even the best legislation and guidance will not prevent or address rape on its own. It needs to be accompanied by robust policies and practices to ensure full implementation. Widespread prejudice, victim blaming, and stereotypes and myths around rape, often among those tasked with preventing it and enabling victims access to justice, must also be adequately addressed. The state must provide transformative reparation to victims, and this means that remedies must go beyond individual victims and should instead seek to transform laws, policies, and attitudes that are at the root causes of sexual violence crimes. While Amnesty International had already earlier done a lot of work on violence against women, this 2018 report I just mentioned was part of a large campaign on consent across Europe that Kirstine also just mentioned. Long-standing efforts in Sweden had already brought about change earlier in 2018, and you've just heard about the magnificent change accomplished in Denmark. And similar action was taken in other countries, including Greece, the Netherlands, Slovenia, Spain, and Switzerland. And besides advocating and campaigning for changes in the law, these activists and many others worked hard on awareness raising and trying to get people to talk about the importance of consent and that sex without consent is rape, all working together with the slogan, "Let's talk about yes." And one such activity is from our own colleagues of Amnesty International here in Belgium, which have the exhibition of What Were You Wearing, which you can actually at this point view here in the European Parliament on your way out after this event. So after speaking about member states' obligations and some of Amnesty's work, I'd like to come back to the role of the European Union. So a lot has already been said today, and I will only highlight two crucial developments, namely the EU accession to the Istanbul Convention and the proposed directive. This cannot be done in this space without acknowledging that the European Parliament has been and remains to be a strong champion in the fight against gender-based violence. The accession of the EU to the Istanbul Convention earlier this year, after many, many years of negotiations, was great news that truly deserves celebration. And I know many of you here today played an important role in making this happen. The scope that the Council was willing to accept, however, is much narrower than the Commission had proposed and that the Parliament had asked for. And this limited scope means that a lot of work remains to be done to ensure a wider scope in the future, alongside work on implementation of current obligations. And the fight to get gender-based violence included in the list of Eurocrimes is an important element in this effort. Amnesty International welcomes the directive on combating violence against women and domestic violence that was proposed by the European Commission in March last year. We find that the position reached by the European Parliament earlier this year further improves on this proposal. And we believe that this directive can make a significant difference in the ongoing fight against gender-based violence in the EU. If, of course, not watered down too much in the negotiations. It has already been said today that one of the most difficult issues in the negotiations is indeed the proposed Article 5 that criminalizes rape with a consent-based definition. The Council proposes to delete this article, with several member states claiming that the EU doesn't have competence. However, the European Commission, the European Parliament, many member states and many others have stated that the EU does have competence to legislate on this. It is therefore a matter of interpretation, and member states have a choice to be ambitious on this issue or to hold back progress. Amnesty International is strongly in favor of including this new criminal offense under EU law because it is a unique opportunity to harmonize member states' laws and create true progress on this issue across the EU. We support the European Parliament in their position that there can be no directive on violence against women without Article 5. This should, of course, go hand in hand with the important measures, including those ensuring comprehensive support to victims with access to both general and specialist services, comprehensive medical care, including sexual and reproductive health services, including also the clinical management of rape and access to safe and legal abortion, and widespread and effective preventive measures, including a clear obligation to ensure comprehensive sexuality education. And finally, last but not least, the training of all professionals that are likely to come in contact with victims or perpetrators, including all law enforcement officials, healthcare professionals, social services, educational staff, and all that is crucial to ensure proper support to victims and avoid secondary victimization. So as was said before, the criminalization of rape based on the absence of consent is already an obligation under the Istanbul Convention, yet not all member states that are party to the convention have adopted such a definition. At the moment, only 13 out of 27 member states have incorporated a consent-based definition in their national law, even though 21 members have ratified the convention. 13 is not nearly enough, but it is already a lot better than 5 years ago. Since 2018, when Amnesty International first analyzed rape laws across Europe, 10 more countries have indeed adopted consent-based laws. These are Denmark, Finland, Croatia, Greece, Malta, Sweden, Spain, and Slovenia in the EU, as well as Iceland and Switzerland. And in the Netherlands, a new law has passed the House of Representatives and is awaiting final approval of the Senate. So as I mentioned, it is clear that changing criminal law alone will not eradicate rape, but it is a crucial step along the way. It sends a powerful message about what kind of society we want to live in, that is, a society that is free from rape and where everyone's sexual autonomy and bodily integrity are respected and valued. Reforming the law can be a fundamental starting point for changing behaviors and attitude, but it must be accompanied by concerted efforts to challenge widespread harmful rape myths and gender stereotypes. By changing the laws and ensuring the end of victim blaming and gender stereotypes in legal proceedings, European governments can ensure that future generations never have to question whether sex without consent is rape and never doubt that perpetrators will be punished. It is clear that there is a positive wave on this across Europe. It is also clear that this is the result of efforts of a passionate, brave movement of women, survivors like Christine, other supporters, and their allies. Amnesty International has worked in support of and alongside these women across the EU and will keep fighting with them for consent-based laws everywhere and for authorities to work to change public attitudes and create a consent culture. Activists are sparking change all over Europe. There's still a great distance to travel, but if our politicians were to display even a fraction of the courage of those women and girls who refuse to stay silent, then laws will be changed. The EU now has an opportunity to ensure real progress on this across the EU, and therefore we call on member states to say yes to including Article 5 in the directive, because only yes means yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Berber. We now open the floor to the audience. Thank you for being here with us. And anyone who would like to give their comments or maybe ask questions, feel free to put your hands up and we will give you the floor. It's always difficult to be the first one. But okay. No comments. Okay, so basically we're mostly in agreement here on this, and we thank you very much for being here with us today. We can always also have a chat afterwards in our cocktail as well, but I believe that if member states cannot agree that yes means yes and a no means no, then we are already destined for failure right from the start. And it angers me a lot because we have already failed so many women in our different member states globally. And after each and every femicide, for instance, after a rape, we hear politicians sending condolences, saying that they're going to act, speaking out very loudly. But then at a time when now it matters on an actual directive, on words put on paper that will become law, we're finding a number of member states, including mine, I say once again, that are holding back from agreeing that consent-based rape definition should be included in this directive, and we will not stop doing so. But to conclude this event today, I invite my colleague and our Vice President of the Socialists and Democrats, Gabi Bischoff, who has been working on various themes, including this and other women's rights policy. So, Gabi, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. And I have to say thank you so much to the speakers, to this strong and very passionate and also sort of influential women here that joined us for this essential debate in the European Parliament at a time where we really stand at crossroads in Europe here. And we have learned again how important and what influence the Istanbul Convention was. I think we always have to highlight it, but also here on the importance of including consent-based rape legislation in this directive on gender-based violence that is negotiated at the moment in the Council. And we know how important it is when both co-legislators negotiate that also pressure is essential until the last minute and not to give up before the deal is done. And I think this is why we are here together. And I wanted really also to thank you because you underlined so much how such a legislation would really help to prevent rape. And I think if you look at the realities of women in Europe, this will be essential, and also to have better access to justice here for rape survivors. And for us, it is really a human rights standard, and that we are going to continue to fight for it. And I would really like to thank also especially Christina Holst that you were here today with us. I think you also show how a woman can make a difference. And if it's supported by many, many progressives, by people that want to have these human rights standards, and you as an expert witness here also on showing the consequences really of not having consent-based rape legislation, and how much steps already were done in some member states, like in your own, really to change the situation here. And I said that being at crossroads at the moment, it's very good to see you all here, because together we can make a difference here to increase the pressure, especially on those member states that are still opposed to include this. And I'm saying this also coming from one of these big member states that are of this position. I think we should get a special and give a special appeal to Germany and France, to founding member states, to big member states, to really look at that we want a Europe that protects and that protects everyone. And here is a core opportunity to do so and to improve the life of many women all over Europe. And this is why we should use this political momentum at the moment to continue to put pressure here and to have the courage to do the right thing at the right moment here. And this is why we as Socialists and Democrats in the Parliament, we will continue until the last minute to try to put pressure and ask for support to include and support Article 5 here and to make Europe a better project. And I have to say also, as I am one of the rapporteurs on the treaty changes that was supported by the Parliament last week, we created again and come up with the proposal for a strong legal basis in our treaties against violence against women. And I think we have to work on each level together here. And this is why I'm happy to close this meeting here in the debates, to thank also all the women in our political group that push so much for that. And like Evin, like Birgit, but also colleagues here in our group and also the Secretariat to make this possible, that we could have this event and that we take the message from here again. We do not give up. We increase our pressure to make sure that in the end we will have a good legislation that serves for a better Europe and really for a society that understands that, and you showed the long way we did go in history on rape and how we changed in 2023, 2024, before the election. It's really time for a consent-based rape legislation. So let's continue to fight for this together, and thank you all for being here at this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabi, and thank all of you for being here with us. I cannot not end without thanking Helle from the S&D Secretariat and the LIBA Committee for her work also to have this very important event with us today. And now we invite you to join us for a quick drink and maybe have a chat together